Hi, guys. questions about why this is happening to us.
Hi, Lee.
Hey folks, how's it going?
Benji, you are GraphQL Foundation today.
Wait, what? Oh yes, I am. How's that happened?
Because he might have added you as a co-host.
Ah.
Or you just used a different, you just used the account.
Well, let's hope not.
Because you're at the GraphQL Foundation. Yes, you are this is the GraphQL Foundation account.
Ah, yeah, no, I'm definitely logged in as me. This is fine.
Really?
Yeah.
Why are you showing us? That's strange. Because I saw that it's Lee.
It is a bit weird.
We will see.
We shall see.
And how are you?
Yeah,
Everything
not too
okay?
bad. How are you?
Yeah, still jet lagged. I arrived in the morning from Sydney, so it's 12 hours backwards.
Oh, that is that is something.
Yes.
Was that 12 weeks to recover, isn't it? It's like one week per hour, I think I've read.
Yeah, try that in one day because tomorrow I go to Oslo for GraphQL workshop. So I have to give the GraphQL workshop. It's the weirdest thing. A company that wants a GraphQL workshop on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday.
That is a bit odd, yeah.
Yeah, never had that, but okay, they pay.
Does that at least go part way back time zone wise, or are you? Yeah.
You mean from so Oslo is essentially our time zone, right?
Right. Yeah.
So but because I was now 3 weeks in Sydney because of conference there, I have to really get adjusted to our time zone. So I'm fighting to at least stay up until 10 tonight. And that's why the work group meeting is excellent because it keeps me from falling asleep.
Very good.
So I already browsed the agenda. There is some struct stuff and some defer stuff. So sounds interesting. By the way, we had last week, we had the first Australian work group meeting, which was quite nice.
That's awesome.
How did it go?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, we mostly discussed things around scalars, how we standardize them better, or how we make it simpler to use a specified by and give a place to the specifications and make them not too complex. Because at the moment, there's date time, which is the only specified scalar. Oh yeah, but Andy was happy.
Awesome. How is
Yeah.
everybody doing?
Great.
Great.
How was GraphQL Summit?
It was hectic. It was good though. A lot of fun. Absolutely.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
I saw there were huge audiences. Sorry, huge audience.
I was very surprised that, yeah, given COVID, that so many people are just like, "Yep, tech conference, let's go." But yeah, it was a really, really good turnout. Absolutely, which is incredible. Yeah, no, it was fun for sure.
Yeah, in Europe it's back to normal with conferences.
It's nuts. Yeah, it's just hard
Yeah.
to realize that we're there again. So
Yeah, I was in Oslo, NDC Oslo. It was 2,500 people. But in
jeez.
Australia they are a bit more cautious.
Yeah.
So that's still
That's
not. I
not
mean,
the
they're
normal
an
numbers.
island.
Yeah.
No.
Oh. Awesome. Are you hosting today, Benji? Because I know you did one of the last ones.
I wasn't expecting to.
Oh, okay. Surprise.
Okay.
I
He's
heard.
very much.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, he's very much looking like Lee. So
Yeah, there we go. I heard good things about your host. You hosted a couple of weeks ago. I wasn't on, but seems like it went really well.
Oh, that's good. I was not very well that day.
Oh,
Glad
okay. Well, yeah.
Glad I managed to hide that.
Awesome.
I think Lee is coming. He pushed the meeting back to this time about 8 hours ago. So I guess his previous commitment might be running a little late.
Yep. Makes sense.
yeah, let's give him a couple of more minutes.
I'm at least merging a few of the pull requests.
Yeah.
So how is the defer stuff going with Apollo? I saw a
Really,
lot of activity.
really well. Yeah. So far, so great. People love it. Just love the functionality. Being able to use defer is, as we all know, we've all been talking about it for a while. So it's really exciting to just get more of it out there. So people are really liking it so far.
Did you guys now, because I looked 2 weeks back,
Mhm.
you were still using the old payload structure. Have you changed that now?
Yeah.
What do you mean by old? You looked 2 weeks ago? What do you mean by old? We put a big effort like a month or two ago into.
Yeah, like when I looked at the Apollo Studio, for instance, it was explicitly sending the header for the August commits.
Oh.
Oh, that's just the number that we wrote down once. Like
Okay.
the format hasn't changed since August, has it?
And it didn't work with the new payload structure. So I found a couple of issues
That
with
would
that.
be super interesting to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you mean by old versus new
Okay.
here? I didn't think anything had changed since what we implemented in August.
Because the incremental stuff, right?
The incremental stuff is the
that
main thing,
is-
but we have that in. Yeah.
That is what we implement. I mean, unless I'm
That,
very.
that is in now. Okay, I will retest if it still doesn't work.
If that's not, please reach out to me, for example, or to Hugh,
Yeah.
and I can discuss with it appropriate. But yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, basically, a few months ago over the summer, like some of us noticed, like, oh, there's all this new stuff. We should make sure we do it, and we made sure all the teams got together and upgraded to doing that. And they said, well, since the thing hasn't actually merged yet, it might change more. Let's just write down the current date and have that be the thing, and hopefully, it won't change too much more. Our goal is to not be embracing and extending the format. Our goal is to hopefully that we can get the into the spec as soon as possible, and if there's any changes, we'll update ours. But
it's great. Yeah, I will retest with our tools that everything works together, and then if it doesn't, I'll get back to you.
Yeah. I hope that's not Studio caching the bundle or something strange like that. But yeah, be good to know.
Yeah.
But we're talking about some interesting defer topics today. It sounds like one of them which could change the spec in particular.
Indeed. In fact, let's kick it off. If you're all happy, I'll take over hosting until Lee arrives.
Awesome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we all know each other anyway, but by joining this meeting. As you know, you've agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct. We'll just go through a quick round of introductions. Hi, everyone. I'm Benji. Let's do it in agenda order, please. So next would be Yakov, who is coming back in 25 minutes.
Okay. Michael, I think you're up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Because Benji. Yeah.
Yeah.
So hi. Hi, I'm Michael. I'm one of the Chili Cream team, and we are mainly working on the .NET GraphQL server, Hot Chocolate.
Awesome. Hugh from Apollo, working on various things like our open source projects.
Mark, do we have a Mark?
Mark's
Oh,
not
Mark's
here.
not here. Me.
No.
Yeah, I'm Alex. I'm at Prano AI. I'm talking about client-controlled nullability.
I'm David, also at Apollo. I work primarily on Apollo server. I've been also sort of like the liaison along with Ivan between making sure that like the various teams at Apollo that are doing the first stuff know what's going on in spec world and vice versa. And Derek is not quite here yet.
He
Rob
might still be
from
joining. Yeah.
First Dibs. I'm working on Defer and Stream.
Exciting.
And I'm Steven at Netflix. I just added my name to the agenda. And I added a quick agenda topic if there's time at the end.
Awesome. Derek's here now. Derek, we're doing intros and we just skipped your name.
Glad I pinged y'all. We have two Zoom set up. This is a little bit
nice.
we were Derek, Mark, and I were sitting in the other Zoom being like, I wonder where everybody is. And then I pinged Benji and said, you guys are in the wrong Zoom. So
Oh, that's great. We just joined the one from the agenda. I guess, is that not the right one? Or yeah.
no, that
got
is
it.
the right one. And the calendar invite has an incorrect one, and that was our bad.
We had the same thing last week with Australia.
We did.
Lee and I were the wrong one.
Mike, yeah. I have like a keyboard shortcut that like pulls the Zoom out of my calendar and joins it, and I always just use that. So,
well, it's very efficient. We just handled things in parallel. So great.
geez. Well, thank you for kicking off intros.
Awesome.
Are we all caught up on that?
Yep, I think so.
Okay, sweet. Thank you guys for taking the lead. I think the plan was to reuse the notes doc that we had used from the previous meeting rather than create new ones. We'll have a notes doc per month. I can get that back added to the agenda file, but one sec, I'll drop a link in the chat so everybody's got it. Where's Zoom chat? There we go. Okay. We've got 3 things on the docket for today. Is that right? Or only 2 things? 2 things on the docket for today. I don't think we need to go over action items. I think we can probably do that in the primary meeting, unless there's something specific that is up and ready, which I don't think that there is. I looked earlier. There's still not. Okay. For the sake of time, we'll jump straight into things, which is Yakov. I think the first one is Yakov here. You don't have Yakov here yet.
Yeah, he's
Yakov
rejoining.
is going to have to rejoin at about past, so 20 minutes time.
Okay,
So if we
let's
can do
rearrange a
other
little bit.
topics first.
Mark, we'll start with you then. When Yakov joins, we can get to him.
Cool. Okay, so this was like very last minute addition to this agenda. We've been thinking about stuff, and then I was messaging Benji, and it's like, oh, there's like this proposal. We have the meeting today. You should join. Okay, so the topic is server-driven UI, which is I'm assuming most people, everyone here is sort of vaguely familiar with what that is, so I'm not going to cover that. And then there's various companies, Yelp included, who have tried to encode a server-driven UI response for a page in GraphQL. And there's obviously, you know, lots of people who have lots of opinions about this. And there's different levels of abstraction that you can do this at. To be honest, at any level of abstraction, if you do it sort of at enough scale, if you try to do a whole page, we kind of run into challenges, which is kind of what we're facing internally at the moment. You could imagine if you're having to like recursively select all possible union members for all possible types, you know, basically your client queries just blow up in size, and you have to either code gen them, treat GraphQL like a compile target, or sort of lose your mind trying to keep it in sync. And, you know, client developers are like, well, is it really server driven if we're having to request things? So that's kind of like the problem space. And honestly, it's got to the point where it's you know, we're really struggling with it, right? To the point where we're kind of, in some cases, just entirely just sending things down as like a JSON, untyped JSON blob because of this problem. And I don't know, it seems like maybe the two could still remain married somehow. I know there's like a prior opinion piece about, you know, describe the data, don't describe the view. So there may be some elements of, what's the phrase I'm looking for? You know, split brain that needs to happen to sort of let this work through GraphQL. Or maybe, you know, the official stance is actually, we don't want to do this in GraphQL, and, you know, this type of thing is just not a good fit for GraphQL. Go use some other transport layer, which is totally fine as well. But this discussion is in the context of if we did want to do it through GraphQL. Benji brought up his structs proposal, and I don't know, like reading that seems like if you had your server-driven UI response, basically like a typed JSON blob encoded as a struct, that would solve a lot of problems. And this would be like a huge benefit for teams trying to do server-driven UI through GraphQL. So that's kind of the discussion topic. And I added, you know, a PR to amend the proposal with that use case. And so the question is, does that change how anyone thinks about this proposal? Because I think Benji shared that there was a little kind of, you know, there was prior discussion on this. So I'm here to sort of, you know, +1 the proposal basically for this use case specifically.
Honestly, Mark, your use case here, I think, is the most compelling so far. Not to say that our other ones haven't been compelling. But you know, this is not the first time we've talked about this sort of struct type. I think Benji's given the most clear framing for it to date. And I'm trying to page, I'm like half sick, so sorry if my brain is like not fully on today. Trying to page back in why we had skated away from structs last time to make sure we had like a clear set of constraints to solve for or pitfalls to avoid. But certainly like this problem statement is very interesting to me. The idea that, you know, GraphQL is originally designed was meant to layer over interconnected data where as you navigate the graph, you're doing incremental data fetching under the hood such that a subselection is in fact a performance optimization, which is obviously not true for a struct. Like a subselection is actually a performance detriment for a struct, or a struct would imply that you're not doing incremental data fetching. You have, it's just a, you know, structured element of memory as opposed to a thing that gets loaded.
Yeah.
which I don't know if we have to enforce that under the hood necessarily, but that's certainly what it implies. Like you get all of it or you get none of it. You don't subselect, and therefore you kind of pay for all of it or you pay for none of it. And I think there's a lot of problems that are shaped like that, where having to do the whole, like the fact that GraphQL very intentionally does not have a select star equivalent is because a blind application of a select star could have potentially horrific performance characteristics. But this is the exact scenario in which you definitely want the select star, and having separate types that not just allow for the ability to the select star, but defaults to that behavior exactly is, I think, quite compelling.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be sort of two almost competing philosophies for how teams build pages, and we have teams who want to go this route, and there's also a trade-off. I mean, I think this makes a lot of sense for like a marketing page or something, like the output of a CMS, and maybe you don't care so much about performance, and you're not going to be doing much nested call a whole bunch of upstream services recursively, and to just kind of have everything, or even in some cases, even if it's not a marketing page, even if it's actually like a highly dynamic page, like a search results page or something, if that is the output of the materialized view, or something like this, like highly optimized on the back end, and actually you do just kind of have this blob emitted from some cache layer or an ML model or something like that, and you're not going to be doing much sort of nested call a bunch of upstream services in that critical request path anyway. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I can only speak for what I've seen kind of internally at our company, but I do suspect that this is true outside of Yelp as well.
Maybe an interesting, I don't know if it's a counterpoint, but a variation on the SDUI that maybe breaks the idea of using structs for it. I don't think doesn't invalidate it necessarily, but to expand the surface. I know Facebook has a handful of server-driven UI framings that do use GraphQL, and an important characteristic to many of them is that along the way of having, very much view model style server-driven UI kind of structures, there are back pointers to true GraphQL object sort of nodes, where I think just by the nature of how they use them, they make sure they get the type and ID of those things, so that if there is needing to refetch subsections of the screen, or if elements change over time, that they don't need to go reload the entire view. They can have the view remain live on the client based on the real data under the hood. And so I think that's just like an extra layer of sophistication that's been added there, that should a struct have the extremely reasonable restriction that it cannot point back to an object, like it can only have other kind of leaf types within it, then you can't do that necessarily without, I guess, having some kind of struct that describes how to refetch some piece of data, which I guess is maybe the corollary. Benji, I know this was a little bit orthogonal to some of the use cases you had in mind, but what's kind of interesting here is this struct proposal file is now getting extended to start to define some use cases. What do you make of this, and how does this fit into the other kind of use cases you had in mind?
Yeah, this is kind of what I was trying to say about the struct solving, or potentially solving the wildcard problem, the select asterisk, but only in very specific use cases. So I'd love to dig in a bit more and find out, do the subfields here actually need their own resolvers? Because struct is very much like, in the way that I've proposed it, it's intended to deal with a blob of data, as in you get that blob of data from somewhere. It's not something that you resolve step by step like you do for the rest of GraphQL. And it is literally, like Mark said, is cause problems. And we've actually started resorting to using big JSON blobs. It's there to solve the big JSON blob issue as much as anything. So I think it's another good use case for it, but I'd have to really look into what Mark was talking about specifically to find out whether it is a good fit or whether there's, you know, parts where it doesn't work so well. I'd also love to hear more about what you were saying with the Facebook server-driven UI stuff, where you were saying about the linking back to the object types and stuff like that. I'd love to understand more on that point. Just as a slight clarification, the struct proposal optionally allows selection sets. So you can effectively narrow if you want, but it's there to represent an object in memory. If you want to only have a smaller amount of that, you can do so, but it's a choice that you could exercise. There was one other point, but I forgot what it was.
I wonder if that's over design or not. Like, I can see why that could potentially be useful, but is it is it more useful just to take the payload as it has? Because I can see that adding like cache complexity, where if you're trying to cache leaf values and reassemble them in some kind of wild and crazy GraphQL intermediate tier, which I know a couple crews are attempting to go build, then this like adds a complication layer to that potentially. But
yeah, you could probably just transform the query to remove the subselections though. But I certainly don't need it to support subselections. It was more an exploration of, here's a thing that we might want in future. Yeah. And I think originally it was proposed partly to solve the metadata issue, where I imagine metadata could get quite big, and to allow subselection on that, because one of the use cases that I have for metadata is the ability to introspect small like types, a type, a field, something like that, and get just the information I need rather than the whole schema introspection. So subselection there is valuable.
You could imagine like a directive to set like a, you know, deny list of things that you don't want in a selection set, but that might be getting too crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that might be too crazy. Usually better to have the set of things you want than to do the other way around.
Yeah.
I'm still not 100% convinced on the metadata, this being the right approach to metadata, which you know, but I think like listing out the handful of use cases that we're interested in exploring around is certainly worthwhile. That's really a useful way to make the proposal more concrete. One thing I'll just flag it. We don't have to talk about it now if it's not useful, but how to deal with unions within the context of structs. I know you've got to take in your proposal, Benji, but it does potentially complicate the use of a union and essentially kind of create two variations of a union implicitly, which is maybe a little bit tricky, and curious if one of is just a cleaner way to make that work. But I'm happy to talk more about the server-driven UI case. Benji, did you have a specific thread that you wanted to pull within there that I mentioned?
Well, first of all, Mark, does it require deeper like resolvers in order to populate this thing, or is it something that you effectively do at a top level resolver style where you build the object and then send it through?
Yeah, that was definitely going to be one of the questions I was going to have for like a, you know, GitHub issue or something. I'm pretty sure that everything is done as a sort of top level thing, but I'm not actually sure if that's like, my problem with that is that the developer has to be sort of very clever when emitting their payload from that one top level God resolver to make sure that the output of that resolver matches a thing that is valid in the schema. They're kind of having to, you know, like do it, like render that tree in their head and make sure that it, you know, it's going to be okay. And I don't know if kind of like closing the door on that would be it would be nice to be able to have resolvers basically for fields in the structs. I don't know if that's like a must-have. I'm struggling to sort of consider the pros and cons. I mean, not having arguments makes sense, but to be able to sort of like override one of the things in your like tree leaf nodes of your structs. I mean, if it complicates the proposal and makes it just impossible, then I think structs without per field resolvers is way better than what we have right now. So that's fine. If we can still make resolvers work, that would be kind of nice. I don't really have beyond that.
Having one resolver at the top makes it much easier to define as a leaf type. Like all other leaf types today kind of fit that model. But I mean, it's a new thing, so we'd have to explore it. David, I see you got your hand.
I'm not sure that I really understand the distinction. Like my understanding is that at the spec level, the GraphQL spec doesn't make a huge amount of the concept of resolver is pretty minimal in the GraphQL spec. I mean, it says, yeah, resolve field value calls a resolver, but like it doesn't even have the concept that like most implementations have of like there's a user specified resolver and there's a default value that is like read from an internal data structure. And it would seem weird to me at the level of the GraphQL spec for it to differentiate between the concept of like a function is being called versus like a value is being unpacked. That seems really implementation dependent to me. The only reason I can sort of understand it is the idea of like, it's sort of like does it finish or not? Like, the only thing that, like, can it hang? Once you've resolved the top level field, you are confident that it will not be an infinite loop. But I don't know, especially for the use case of like, of unpacking a recursive tree. I don't see why you'd want to limit the implementation's mechanism of providing. Like if I'm imagining, unpacking a tree, I don't see why I would have to write a top level function in like my user code that like unpacks an entire tree. That doesn't seem helpful or relevant to like the spec essentially.
Yeah. I imagine that as we would go about assembling the spec text, let alone an actual implementation, some iteration of a resolver would emerge, because a very important part of what GraphQL is doing when it's creating leaf types is ensuring that the raw value that it got from a service actually maps to the expectations of that value that GraphQL defines. And so there's just sort of, I guess you could call it a validation step, but it's really a value transform. Like given some value from the backing service, how does that go through? Yeah, go ahead, David.
And I guess the other thing is, given that we do allow selection sets, it would seem really strange for me to say like, you are required to like produce an entire infinitely nested, thing, even if you're not using the recursive field. Like, if you have like, a trace or something, and there's a top level like ID field, and then there's the entire recursive thing, and you're only selecting ID, it would be really strange to say like the implementation requires you to manifest in memory a ginormous thing and then throw most of it away.
Right.
Yeah, but the observable difference there wouldn't be one, right? So the spec could still say, here's what you do. So long as you can't observe the difference, then it's fine for you to optimize that away inside your own implementation. Kind of the intent with what I've sort of described is that there is no logic in it. It is just data. That's the intent. If you want to actually build resolvers into your GraphQL.js implementation to build what that data is, that's fine. But I think from the specs point of view, there is explicitly not meant to be logic there. And I think that's what I was trying to sort of cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
I think, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, no. I think I still struggle with that is being just a blob of data. Because that's one of the core principles of GraphQL, that you can like stay what you want, right? And I mean, I discussed with Benji that a while back. I even think it should have like fragments and stuff like that. If we go down the struct route, because it would be so foreign. It's like the same structure, but then you cannot apply the same things on that in the query, and you really would need to look into the schema to see the difference. But when you write the query, you cannot really see the difference. That's my main point there.
Yeah. This is why I think the really understanding the use cases matters a lot, because if this is simply a minor variation on a GraphQL object where you just don't have arguments, then a bunch of things break. And it's part of why is the subselection over engineering, or is this really kind of key to the use case? Because like if there is in fact a difference between a subselection might not hang, whereas a full selection could potentially hang, then like that calls into question the whole idea that this is a blob of data that had you not had this feature, you'd just JSON stringify and stick in there, or define a JSON scalar type, where the intent of this is to say like, okay, you wanted a JSON scalar type, but hey, wouldn't it be better if you actually had a described schema for that as well? At least that's my understanding of what the pitch is here is.
Yeah, I want to
given flat data. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I want to echo that. Like we have people who are doing that today at multiple companies, and even if that's not the original intention of GraphQL, that is how people are using it. And with like a big JSON blob, then that's like not typed. Like you still are going to have people doing more or less the same thing. Like you're going to have like lots more if statements and switch statements on the clients, but we have that right now anyway. At least now it's going to be typed, and we'll have like more proper tooling around it and like spec approved opinions. But again, I get that this is like a pretty big shift away from the original intention of GraphQL and this nice, beautiful, abstract data. So I totally get the, I totally get all views on this. But yeah, this is kind of what's happening in the world anyway. So
the use case very much exists. Like I'm convinced after talking to plenty of people that like this is a very common pain point where there is in fact structured data that does not contain deep asynchronous resolvers, but does contain a fair amount of variability and ends up being actually like the selection settiness of GraphQL ends up being a block and hinder to productivity rather than an asset. And so like I think really kind of narrowing in when do we use this and when do we not, and what are the right constraints for it, and how do we make sure that we avoid pitfalls, that's the exploration space. But I'm very convinced that this is a real problem that needs to have a solution. Yeah, go ahead, David.
And Michael's comment about we should avoid the select star kind of thing. I mean, I think that is what we're talking about though, right? And like recursively as well.
Yeah, the thing that I fear a bit is you design your client application for a certain response type. And because it's now a struct, you suddenly get more data than you really requested, because suddenly it's the same query shape, but you just get more data. That's what I kind would want to avoid.
I think that if you are a client developer writing a query that contains a struct, hopefully, maybe tooling will call that out or something, but it would be your expectation as the person writing the query that, hey, this is sort of going to blow up arbitrarily, and, you're on the hook for marshalling that yourself basically, and, writing the if statements and stuff. And like, yeah, like that is essentially, I think, what we're saying, right?
Yeah, it depends a bit, and that's where we don't know where the line is at the moment. So I'm not opposed to struct. I think it's very intriguing, but there's a fine line we have to walk. Is it really a JSON scalar? And yeah, I talked also with Benji on that. Is it really a scalar, or is it more than just a type JSON object?
It's not a scalar in the sense that it's structured. Sorry, David, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my read on this proposal is that it sort of provides a couple things. It says there are some data types where you basically might want to have two features. One feature is the ability to get a default selection that might expand later. So it's good if this is explicit, so your code gen and all can do that, but a default selection where you don't have to ask specific things. And also it might be nice to be able to describe this both as input and as output automatically. And in exchange, there are features of GraphQL like arguments and aliasing that you don't get to use with this. By just a quick aside, I don't really understand why directives are something you wouldn't be able to use here. I don't get why if and skip would not be things. If you're going to have selection sets, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to have if and skip and so on also. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I just want to throw out a use case that we would use it for in Apollo's API. We have a particular part of our API that is sort of a generic query field for query types for querying the Druid database, time series database. And one of the main things you do when you're querying this is you group by certain fields. And when you're grouping by fields in a query, and so we made sort of like a flexible, common things that we use all over our app, we make specific fields that specifically do, but we also have this sort of generic thing that's really nice for just like experimenting with the API. And if you want to group by a field, those are basically going to have to be the fields you select. And so the naive way to do this is you would provide which fields to group by in an argument to the like query field, and then also select the same sets of fields in the selection set. And we felt like that was going to be like not really a good experience. So we did the actually sort of hacky thing where the actual query that gets run at like, a certain level of the schema depends on which fields you select in a nested selection set, which has all of the negative impacts you might imagine. And it would be great if we could move to a world where we say which fields we care about via the argument, and then we just say, yeah, give me the fields I asked for, and it just gave those back. And so it would be a pretty dynamic thing that you get back. Yeah, that's a use case that I don't know is covered here. That would be a good fit for this, I feel like.
Yeah. Okay, I want to be conscious of time. Sounds like where we're at with this is collecting more use cases is incredibly valuable, and it's adding a lot of color and clarity to how we might make decisions around this. I'm very convinced this is a real problem. I've talked to more than enough people to understand this is a very real problem. And so let's kind of stay living in the world of collecting use cases to help us guide decision. All right, Yakov, welcome. I know you've got an awesome agenda item on the docket, so I want to hand it to you next.
Thanks. This microphone's working? Just a quick check.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to share my screen in a total fake out. I want to discuss the second item I listed first, if that's okay. Because I think, probably incorrectly, if past experience is going to prove correct, that it might go quicker, and then we can get to the juicier item next. So let's see. Basically, I wanted to reopen. So basically, the two items that I want to talk about is how incremental delivery sort of interacts with fragment modularity, or I'm not sure what we might want to call it, fragment independence. And the first has to do with one of the decisions, or really the second in the agenda, but the first item I want to talk about has to do with one of the decisions we made in terms of how deferred fragments are interpreted when they're nested. So this is originally Benji's point and suggestion or problem and really discussion that I am sort of reopening, because I think we potentially jumped, potentially the choice we made may have impact for fragment modularity issues later on. I just want to make sure that we're making that choice consciously. So basically, this is Benji, and Benji, please feel free to jump in if I'm mischaracterizing, or you're the original issue that you raised, so please feel free to do so. But this is one of the discussions, and Rob has this great repository where all of our discussions have been really, not all, but I assume as many as possible have been written down. I assume hopefully all of them. And so the question here is, if we have deferred fragments, like in this example that Benji has over here, and they're nested, how this should be interpreted. So I'm just gonna, basically we have, in this example, we have one deferred inline fragment that contains another one, a name fragment later on, and it contains another inline fragment that also has defer on it, which contains both a field and that name fragment. And then there's a third level of nesting of defer. So basically the idea is that you can have nested fragments, obviously. And then what happens exactly when we put the defer directive on them? So when we're not using defer, all of these are merged in the collect field step. And so if you can imagine for a second that defer wouldn't be here, it basically, the above would be essentially equivalent to what Benji has here in his second example below, where these fragments are sort of separated. In the end, they all get merged together anyway. So it doesn't really matter whether you, it may matter to you in terms of, how you organize the fragments and where you store them and where, but to the execution engine, once they're merged, they'll be the same. So it doesn't really matter if they're nested or not. But the question is potentially, just thinking about the semantics of defer, these two options could have very different behavior. Meaning in this example, we have 3 fragments that are all deferred. And imagine we had some additional fields over here on users list that were not deferred. And so all of these 3 fragments would not come in the initial response, but otherwise they'd all be equivalent. But you can imagine that this semantics, the first example might have, this syntax might have different semantics in that you might expect that that whatever was in the initial response would come first. Let's just imagine Benji has a few fields that are not deferred. And then secondly would come whatever fields are in the first fragment. And then thirdly would come whatever's in the nested. And finally, you would get this. And that could be useful because maybe you have a component of UI that you can defer loading it, but even when you do load it, there's maybe a subcomponent of that can be further deferred. And we also have a companion issue, I guess, to this, is this other question raised in the forum of what about specifying an order or a priority to different deferred sets. And this may be a different way of doing the same thing, order 1, order 2, but to my eye, it looks pretty similar to what might happen if we respected this nesting, whereas with the argument syntax of priorities or orders, that's sort of semi-brittle. You have to, if you want to change the priority of one item, you have to be aware of all the different arguments, values for the different orders or priorities and all the other different fragments in the query. So to fast forward a little bit, we basically have decided in the spec right now to not respect this nesting. And I'll basically, I was thinking about the other issue and about fragment modularity. And basically, I think it's interesting. Benji raised this issue initially because he was concerned that this could be, potentially bad. But actually, he writes over here, and maybe he still feels this way, that potentially we have to do this because of the idea of for fragment modularity. And I would agree with that first initial concept, and I think concerns about this potentially being an attack vector I'm not 100% clear on them, and I would love to have greater elaboration from the group about it. I mean, basically, the way the GraphQL JS implementation works right now is that in this query, meaning the one that's basically we're considering the nested query to be equivalent to this parallel query. We create repetitive branches of execution for each of these deferred fragments, in which field execution is potentially unless we're caching, which hopefully we are, but potentially we're sending additional data and burning additional CPU cycles for those separate branches of execution. And all of those are deferred using promises in the GraphQL JS implementation to come later than the initial one. And so the only difference that I see between this, which is what we currently do, and this, which we compile away, is that in this example, the initial responses would have an order, which means we would hold, even if the execution of one of our deeper levels had completed, we wouldn't send it until the previous one had been sent. And other than that, I mean, the dynamics of actually how it's managed on the server, because that's the only observable difference, I don't think it would be too different. And certainly we could change it because that would be invisible to the user if there would be open up an attack vector. And in fact, the idea of holding on to a group of fields and then holding on to another group of fields, and then as soon as the first one is free to go, then we can send the deeper ones that have been ready for a while. That's exactly what we're doing right now in Stream. And so the idea of holding on to things that are potentially ready to send but not sending it, is something that we're doing already. So I just, I want to reopen this discussion about fragment modularity, just because I think it's important that we, if we do reject,
It's not really flattened. No? It's just spawned off. It would still have the structure. Right? It's just spawned off as a promise.
What GraphQL JS will do is when it does I think collect fields, is it would recurse through all of these fragments as long as they're under the same root object, which would be user's list in this case, and return that list of these are all the deferred fragments it found, and then start executing everything that wasn't inside a defer that did get merged, and then execute each defer separately. But it's not imposing any order on those because they are under the same same root object.
More concretely, also if you have like lower level things, it could be that like if you have proper fragments, it could be that a subfield overtakes a parent. So the order is not guaranteed even if you have a deeper structure. Like the example here is essentially the same level and also the same fragment, right? It's very constructed. But if we had, for instance, avatar, which has a subfield URL, and that would be deferred, it could also be overtake one of the parents, but then the execution engine would make sure that it's not sent down to the client before the previous defers would complete. Like there is some security that patches are applicable. I get your point with, but I think it's two issues.
I think I agree with you. We make sure that we always send, we can't send a child field of avatar, let's say, if URL was a subfield, before we send the parent field, because we'll never send a path that doesn't make sense. We'll never send a payload with a path that the client hasn't already seen. So, but that's not what we're talking about over here. What we're talking about over here is even under the same path, meaning all these deferred fragments are under the path of users list, right? We're talking about whether there could be an order to the different fields, and whether we might want to use nested defer to imply that order. With another alternative potentially being in the future being something like what this other syntax over here of this here this is a little off because we don't currently allow defer on fields at all. But the idea is take a look at this order field. Is that the way? If we want to preserve space for this possibility, it seems to me like this isn't necessarily the way to go to for it. Plus, yeah.
You had a better example. I looked at one example where you used the alias syntax on a spread. I think it was in your issue 1. You linked to that.
Yeah, and so that's the other issue. They are somewhat linked. I think they're definitely somewhat linked, but this I think is but I think something to think about it. Just to think about. No matter what we say about that other potentially much more controversial issue, I think we might want to rethink this one.
Yes, I just think the example you linked to actually with the alias syntax, that's better to talk about than. So this is a very constructed example, and I mean what Benji showed there is that you, and we have that in some customer use cases where you can actually create queries that have like the defer stuff, but actually overall have a worse execution time. And that could be that's one argument why I always want the server to override sometimes certain defers.
And I think we've had a lot of discussion about whether to allow optimizing or not. I'm saying let's go with that, our current behavior, which allows a lot of optimizing. The only thing that would change here is that later responses would not be sent until earlier responses. And it could be that the server then has additional flexibility. It could pre-compute or not. That's depending on what it thinks is the best thing to do. But it would respect the order, at least, that was indicated by this nesting.
David has his hands up, but one thing here. So this is constructed, and that's why I think your other example is better. Like, I think there is like, when we talk about fragment modularity, then we want to have like this order thing, but this actually could be optimized in this case. Like, actually what we are doing here is we defer user frag, and then we deferring avatar URL and then avatar bio from a data standpoint. Because we are repeating this fragment here, so that could be optimized. But with the fragment modularity thing, I think you're right. There we want to have a guarantee, because the client wants to know if a fragment is fulfilled. That's also what Matt has as an issue. So I just think these are two separate things.
Yes, they're definitely separate things. For the purpose of this example, you could say user fragment is different than, you can look at these as different collections of field, and they only happen to be the same. And this could be an example that's optimized. But that's true no matter, the fact that it could be optimized is true no matter, this query, which we currently allow and interpret the first one as, this also could be potentially, optimized. In fact, Benji points out that this could be optimized even more, because we could potentially, the server could decide not to respect or honor to inline. So, I'm not sure what the downsides really of respecting this inlining, respecting this nested level of defer are.
Yeah, because if you from a database standpoint, if you anyway, like, let's say you have MongoDB, and you anyway load the document, you're not projecting things, and you anyway have now bio and avatar URL there. Why defer? Why not just put it in the first defer and skip the second?
No, but that's good. Meaning that's exactly what this syntax would allow you better to do. We've had discussions about whether you should be allowed to do that, but with this syntax of the nested defer, this second defer, if in that scenario, wouldn't necessarily have to be honored. But in this example that we have, it would be a lot where all of these are happening in parallel. It actually would be a little bit more difficult to nest, this second defer, defer within the first. So I'm just not quite sure. Originally, the suggestion was that allowing these nested defers and allowing the user through an operation with nested defer to impose an order on fields would serve as an attack vector. That was the original claim. And then within this discussion, we pointed out that actually our current implementation isn't doing that. And so it was like okay, we're avoiding this attack vector. But I'm not quite sure what the attack vector is. If there is one, it's pretty similar to the current implementation of stream, which would be very bad. So, or would be, I guess, just, maybe, I'm not sure. So,
David, what do you think? You have your hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I've had my hand up for a few moments. I just wanted to throw out there, on the one hand, despite what I'm about to say, I actually kind of think the current spec is pretty good, and I'd love to see it just move forward and without any big rethinks. But if we are still having big rethinks on the table, I will say, I think the root cause here is the choice that was made to prioritize with defer, the idea that the block inside the defer matches the data sent on the wire in that payload, and not just like the data that is available after that payload, including previous payloads cumulatively, which is a prioritization against how the rest of GraphQL works, where like merging is merging. If we are doing big rethinking, maybe we could put on the table the idea that like we just don't send the same data twice, and it's the job of the client. If the client wants to be able to present to like the user of the client library an object that matches a deferred fragment exactly, then it just has to remember the field that it got earlier in the stream. Like I think all of this is downstream of like the decision that the thing that's on the screen now should not be exactly identical to the same query without the nested user frags. Like if we have, again, I would love us to just move forward with our lives and get this in the spec, but like, I don't understand why we think it's more important that the low-level bytes on the wire that are sent to the client library exactly match these sub fragments. And I would be much happier with a world where what's on the screen now is exactly equivalent to only specifying the top level user frag.
I think that's a great point. That wider question, though, is sort of why I saved. It's more. I think we can sort of address the narrower point here before we bring that right back in when we discuss the next issue.
Yeah, and
I mean, I want to say that
a lot of these things also can be minimized by using data loaders. I mean, it's also implementation standpoint from a user here. Like if, for instance, okay, user list maybe not, but if you have certain things like cached with data loaders, they wouldn't have the additional cost. Like you wouldn't fetch this twice from the database and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. But the only thing that I wanted in this issue is to discuss whether we want to allow defer to clients in operation to use these nested format to specify an order on defer versus something that might come later with, something that we might implement later, like this argument of order, which doesn't seem it seems much more brittle. We're going to discuss rethinking everything, I suppose, in a second. But can anyone better explicate why this would be bad? We're currently not doing that.
Just move on to the next thing because I think
okay, so let's.
It makes it more clear. I think we caught up on this.
Okay.
I mean,
so
I do want to describe like what the behavior that we're talking about. It was like that was basically when we first started looking into this. It was feedback from Facebook that they had tried to do field merging with defer and ultimately decided that it was better to do this kind of forking of execution where the deferred fields don't merge back into the non-deferred fields. And I believe like the reason was that like trying to do that merging across like many deferred fragments, especially with fields that have like fragments inside of fragments, very nested objects going all the way down, was very complex. Basically from that feedback, we didn't like look into it anymore. If it turns out that it actually is easy and I'm not against it, but I just want to like explain why like this is the avenue we went down from the basically like the start of this project.
Okay. Well, by popular demand and time constraints, we can move on to we should probably move on to the second potentially mind-blowing suggestion.
You might also have to give us a high level and then ask us to chime in the discussion thread too. Just knowing that
we're gonna blow your minds in less than 30 seconds. So basically the suggestion here is to first note, as was pointed out previously, that we made this specific choice to require branching of execution. We've made the specific choice to say that when fragments are deferred, what the client will get later will have all the data in that payload, and the client is sort of allowed to discard whatever it's seen already and should have all the data that it has within that next payload. So that is potentially a choice that we might want to revisit, but I think we can revisit it through an ordered set of paths. And that is first, not to say that we should defer, sorry for the pun, that we should defer releasing incremental delivery until fragment modularity and a new response format and all the wonderful things in that RFC are merged, but specifically that we should take one component, this idea of alias fragments, and say that all deferred fragments should have to have an alias. And skipping down from the work example, I think we could try reading that. You can read that at your leisure. The basic idea is that we can get a payload that looks something like this. So every time that we have the name, the alias for the fragment, whether it's in the initial payload or whether it's in a later payload, we will always have it named, and we no longer need a label, and clients will always know whether on the initial payload or on a later payload, exactly which fragments have been delivered. Now, one of the basic concerns about this form of fragment modularity is repetition of data. But the argument that I would make, and it's kind of an interesting argument considering what we've heard so far, is that our current implementation of incremental delivery already repeats data. And so the idea of repeating data potentially a little bit, you see over here how in the initial query ID is repeated within these fragments. The idea of repeating it here, this is an optimization. I mean, the server decided not to respect that deferred name data fragment because it figured out that maybe through data loader, it already has the name, and so it can send the ID as well. So this is sort of like an intermediate step. And so this optimization is made by the server to send name data initially. But the idea would be here of requiring that the entire fragment be sent would be just limiting the optimization that the server could make, with the advantage that it's very, very clear in this response format which fragment is there. Now, there are other possibilities, other ways this could be done, including the fulfilled field, but this is, in my mind, the simplest and best way to do it. That is, if we want to repeat data. I think the next level of fragment modularity with that new response format is something that we could use to make sure that data is not decreased, data is not duplicated too much in non-deferred payloads. But in deferred payloads, we're basically already repeating data. So the idea of always requiring it to use name fragments basically just simplifies our use of labels. Every time that you have a deferred fragment, it'll go in the path. And so currently, if you have a stream nested in multiple field nested in like multiple different branches of execution, the label on that have the same path, the label on that won't actually help you distinguish which branch of execution you're in, which is like a subtle problem, just a subtle problem that bespeaks how it's confusing to have these different paths and labels. What we really want is the branches of execution to be encoded. I think a better solution would be to have the branches of execution encoded within the response itself. And for time constraints, I'll have to leave us there. But I definitely love for greater feedback in this discussion. And again, I really don't want to suggest that we have to delay all of incremental delivery until we figured out everything about fragment modularity. I think this idea of taking this one component makes a nice compromise. There is some weakness in that even when the server optimizes, it does duplicate fields, but through compression, it's been pointed out, if that's being used, that might help. This format would also help an additional concern that Benji pointed out. I'll highlight it for you here, and you can link over there about how we can batch deferred fragments at the same path level, similar to how potentially we can batch individual stream items now that we use an array. So there's a bunch of helpful things. It's a consistent response format. And I think it can pave the way to further optimizations and mesh well with whatever solution we eventually come to with fragment modularity. For your consideration.
Very much a thing worth talking about.
Did Matt already comment on that?
No, not yet. I think his comments would definitely be very welcome and helpful.
Because when we talk about fragment modularity, we are also talking about like passing in variables into fragments and things like that. And so,
yes.
So I really like the idea of the reusing essentially the aliasing on the fragment spread. But I don't know what his thoughts are, because he worked on that a bit longer than we.
Yeah. There's something really interesting here. Thank you for keying this up. It's worth talking about. I know we're at time, but I think the specific request here is for everyone to go take a look and channel some of your thoughts into the discussion thread so we can pick this back up and run with it. All right, folks. Thanks for a healthy discussion. See you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.